Lazarus may have been Jesus' best friend. In fact, Jesus was very close to the siblings, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. So this death, this loss would have cut very deeply. Of course, Jesus knew about and ministered to all those who had confronted death, but I think this death hit him in such a way that he had to consider his own mortality. Yes, Jesus was human and would have to meet death. But Jesus was also frustrated about the power and the inevitability of death. You see, Jesus had been testifying that he came from and abided in God, the fullness of whom brings grace upon grace. The foundation of Jesus' own revelation of God's glory and the performing of signs, you know those signs, turning water into wine, giving the blind man sight. All of these signs come from Jesus because Jesus came that we might have life and have it more abundantly. Oh, but death. Death steals Jesus' friend, and Jesus cries. But don't let the tears fool you. Jesus was sad, yes, it hurt, but let's not over-sentimentalize Jesus' tears. Jesus was sad, he was very sad. But those words they translate as greatly disturbed are better translated as indignant. Yes, Jesus was angry or a little annoyed or a little distressed. Jesus was angry and distressed at the injustice and the unfairness of it all. That death has the people, including believers like Mary and Martha. Death has them in its grip. And Jesus seems to be disappointed in how quickly Mary and Martha resign themselves to the power and the finality of death. It must have saddened Jesus to see how loss and grief can divert our faith and our attention from the belief that the power of God or the power of love is stronger than the sting of death. Oh, but death is strong. And it does feel final. Jesus knows. And even as Mary and Martha confront their loss, Jesus too confronts the loss. It can't be lost on Jesus that he will meet the same fate. He will know the sting of death. He will know the darkness of a grave. But Martha testifies, and we know the testimony. Martha has faith, and she testifies to Jesus that she knows that death will be conquered. But then she gave a qualifier. I know, Jesus, that death will be conquered on the last day. On the last day. Martha's faith is there, but she gives too much power to death. Martha is talking about endings. Yet Jesus proclaims it differently to her. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. Now, I don't know about you, but I would have said, Jesus, wait a minute. What did you just say? Even though they die, will live. You're contradicting yourself, Jesus. I hope I would have the presence of mind. Jesus, you're contradicting yourself. Even though they die, will live. Jesus isn't talking about death as an ending. He's talking about death as a beginning. Now, I want to disabuse you of something. We're not talking about ghosts. And for you Walking Dead fans, we ain't talking about zombies. Because if you want to talk about ghosts and zombies, we're still talking about the power of death. No, Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, though they die, will live. Jesus is talking about something else. Oh, see, you all looking at me like I'm just telling you what he said. How hard is it to believe that death is a beginning? Because it hurts so much to face losing those we love. Mary and Martha, oh boy, they were clear. Notice, they didn't just start just talking about, let's remember Lazarus. No, when Jesus showed up, Mary and Martha go, you could have prevented this if you had been here. They were in no mood. You could have prevented this, Jesus, if you had been here. Doesn't that sound familiar? I know it does. We spend most of our time trying to prevent death. And I know it's how humanity is wired. We want to survive. We want to outrun death. Honey, oh my God, we'll do anything to live. We exercise. We take, all these supplements. We want to live. If you had been here, Jesus, you could have prevented death. And see, that's how we want to do. Whether we are healthy or whether we are battling illness, we call upon God to prevent death. The people were all wondering and whispering, why didn't the great preacher who gave the blind man sight, why didn't he just save his dear friend? Why did he prevent the death of his friend? And when God doesn't prevent death, we assume that God isn't listening, that God is absent. And here's the one that I hate the most. And when death comes, we say, God wanted death. Please do not tell me and tell anyone that when death comes, that it was God's plan. Please, if you hear nothing else from me, and anytime you hear me, when someone dies, please do not say that it was God's will and God's plan. Please don't do it. And if you want to talk about it later, we can talk about it, but just take that rule of thumb. But that's what we assume that God wants. But I want you to know something. If Jesus has the present mind to say, I am the resurrection and the life, even though they die, they will live. Obviously, it is not death that is what is wanted or planned, not even by God. They will live. They will live. When Jesus asked where Lazarus was, and where it told them to move the stone, Martha was emphatic. He's dead. He's dead. It's been 4 days. He's decaying. It's over. Life has ended. The death has won. But Jesus' prayer reveals that God is not absent, that God does not want death, that God is not interested in death prevailing. Jesus prayed that, God, I thank you for hearing me. And if Jesus prays that, it shows me that even when the breath was going out of Lazarus' body, God heard Jesus' prayer. Even as Lazarus' body was decaying in that tomb, God heard Jesus' prayer. So when Jesus called him by name, Lazarus, come out, Lazarus heard the voice of the good shepherd and came out of that tomb. Lazarus heard Jesus and came out of the tomb. Now, look, let me give you something else. I'm not here to give you a course in miracles. I'm not here to give you a course in the science or the history. If you want that, go elsewhere. I'm telling you what the I am said. The I am said, I am the resurrection and the life. The I am said, death is not going to win this one. The I am said, I'm not talking about endings. I'm talking about beginnings. So whatever death is, it can't beat God. Lazarus, Come out. Lazarus heard, got up, walked out of the tomb. And then I love with such flair, with a brio of social justice, unbind him and let him go. You didn't hear me. Let me connect to you. Let me say, Lazarus, come out. Come out, Lazarus. Lazarus came out and then said, unbind him and let him go free. Let's press the metaphor. We came out. Now let's be free. Let's be free. Because what? I came that you will have life and that you will have it more abundantly. Do you believe it? Then stop being dead. I came that you will live, so let's not be dead. Even before we get to the grave, some of us are just dying, just pulling the grave up on us. Get up, live. I came that you will have life and that you will have it more abundantly. This means, Jesus also said, when Martha expressed her faith, people said, well, Pastor, then why aren't we raising people from the dead? You're still giving death too much power. Jesus said, if you believe, he didn't say you can raise folk from the dead in this text. He said, if you believe, you'll see the glory of God. Oh, I'm about to mess with you now. Because see, what I want you to understand something. You are not God's secretary. When the glory of God happens, ain't no telling what's going to happen. How many times have you said, I don't know what happened, it just happened? Maybe that was the glory of God. You don't know what happened, but when the glory of God comes, anything can happen. How can death compete with the glory of God? Here's what I got to get out of here because I'm moving too far. I got to get out of here. Death is a force that steals life. Death is an agent of sin and all that opposes God. So death is coming after you. I'm just going to tell you. Death is going to get you. It is. All the saints who went before us, they met death. And they were carried on to tombs and graves. Because death is a disruptor of life. And so our focus, often rightly so, is most often on how to wrestle with death. In our fear of death, our resignation under the power of death, we forget, though, that Jesus came so that we might have life and that more abundantly. Death is not compatible with life that God gives. It isn't. We often forget that the glory of God created life. That's where creation came. It was the glory of God that brought it all into being in the first place. How can something that brings all into being somehow ends when death comes? It does not compute. If the glory of God can create it, then how can death overcome it? It does not compute. And I think that's the invitation of the saints who did meet death. To see death not as an ending or the final step, but as the beginning of life in the unending presence of God. To see death as the beginning of a life that can no longer be restricted or determined by the sting of death. Here's what I mean. Lazarus came out of that tomb, and guess what? Lazarus died again. Lazarus went to another grave later on. Met it. But I know something about, I don't know who Lazarus was, but I tell you this, after being brought out of that tomb and saw death again, like, oh, this ain't nothing. But Pastor, death is real. Death is real. It is. No matter how Jesus persists to bring us life, no matter the lengths Jesus went to that we might have life, we live beholden to death. Jesus speaks life, and yet we remain resigned to death as the grand finale. And even if we can accept that Jesus is the resurrection life, we think about receiving the blessing of life at the end of days. Oh, there's too much worrying about the end of days. You know, I think that we just worry too much about what's happening later on. But see, we can have a blessing now. We can have life now. And we know that the saints and the martyrs who've died are still part of our ongoing story. In some ways, they haven't died in that sense. They're still a part of our own. We know the saints and martyrs speak and witness through our lives, in our work, and even through our death. Lazarus' death and resurrection witness to his family and to his community. In resurrecting Lazarus, not only does Jesus minister to the dead and create for him a new beginning, but he ministers to everyone watching. Stop fearing and letting death have the final say. And so when we call our saints and martyrs by name, they live beyond the grave. Living beyond the grave. I want to press the metaphor again. That's a bunch of us who are stuck in tombs. We're walking around, but boy, we are stuck in tombs. We all, and some of us don't even think that we deserve life. We're stuck in all those places of dead and decayness and places of dryness and half-life. But Jesus calls us out of those tombs. Those tombs of hatred, of shame, of not being who we truly are, the tombs of racism and white supremacy, the tombs of anti-Semitism. Those are tombs. Tombs of addiction and depression. Those are things that bind and hold us back from the life that Jesus brings. But Jesus came that we will have life and that more. And we have faith in this promise of life. I want us to remember this. Do not let death have the last word. Don't let it have the last word. Let our lives and our ministries bear witness that there's a power that is bigger than death. We accept God's gift of life that death cannot touch. We may not ever prevent death, but death can never prevent us from having the life that Jesus promised us. Amen.